Welcome back to another live. This one is going to be very different to what I usually do with my topics and my Ken reads. I am going to be reading from a letter, but this one is very different from a lot of the letters that I've read thus far. I had a user reach out and tell me that a former partner of theirs who identifies with a fearful avoidant attachment style returned them, and not only returned, but also confessed that they were actually in love with their partner all this time. So I'll get into this story in a minute, but just to paint a little bit of a picture of this person who shared this letter with me, for the longest time ever, thought their partner didn't care about them at all, that they just weren't that into them. But when this person returned 7 years later, confessed, no, actually, I did love you a lot. I was just afraid to share these feelings with you. So I wanted to share this story because it's so easy for us to often at times doubt ourselves, our intuition, and think, oh, my avoidant partner never gave a damn at all, when it's so not necessarily the truth. And that's why I'm keen to get into this letter today. So let's dive in to Miranda's letter and go through this, because I think this will be a very interesting experience for everyone to be a participant of. And feel free, as always, to leave your questions in the question mark box below, because I will get to Q&A at the end of this. All right, let's do this. Miranda writes, Andy and I met in the fall of 2013. We only dated for 2 to 3 months, but it was full of laughter and chemistry. We had a lot in common, and it felt unusually easy to be around him. He had a history of being physically abused as a kid and cheated on multiple times. I knew he had trust issues, but he often said how safe he felt with me and how scared it sometimes made him feel. He was fiercely independent, but simultaneously craved connection. He was a serial dater. Always said he felt like he had to be Superman. He always put other people's needs first, and while he showed emotions with me, there was always a kind of tough exterior, and I could tell he saw emotions as weakness deep down, and sometimes presented with a sense he was somehow superior to others because of his experiences. Not in a narcissistic way, more just self-righteous, afraid of betrayal, afraid of misunderstanding from others. And he partied and slept around a lot. Though he never got mad at me, it was just something I always worried about down the line if we'd ever continued being in a relationship. But lots of this does seem like classic fearful avoidance stuff in hindsight. Correct. Just before Christmas, he found out that he was going to be relocated across the country for work and may not be returning. Now, I was in grad school at the time and not in a position to move, nor would I have for someone that I'd only known for such a short time. He didn't want to do long distance because he'd been cheated on before. I respected his wishes, and although we were both very sad, we amicably ended it. A few days before he was supposed to leave, I wanted to say a final goodbye, so we had dinner and ended up back at his place. We had a very romantic evening, and I was a virgin at the time, and we almost had sex, but I ultimately held back because I didn't want to do it and get attached to someone I didn't think I'd ever see again. We woke up the next morning, and I asked him to breakfast before I left, and he said no, because he had stuff to do. I was kind of surprised after the beautiful night we had. He seemed a little irritated, but I didn't think too much of it. That would be withdrawal phase hitting right there. Anyways, Andy, his relocation ended up getting cancelled, and a few weeks later, I asked him if he wanted to put a label on us and make it a real deal. He told me that he saw me more as a friend or little sister and thought we'd be better off just as friends. Now, I was pretty hurt and felt used. We didn't talk for a few months, but eventually reconnected, and he actually ended up becoming one of my best friends. We talked every day for the next 2 years and occasionally hooked up. About a year into our friendship, he ended up telling me that he was seeing me as just a friend, which was a lie. He felt I wasn't ready at the time for a relationship, and he thought saying he saw me as a friend would help me move on easier than telling me I wasn't ready. I was shocked to hear this, but I was also very mad because I felt I deserved honesty. It hurt so much to be told he saw me as a friend when I had been sure he felt differently. I think he owed me the truth. I was denying it, but I still had feelings for him. After those 2 years, I realized I would never fully move on, and I had to cut him off. We had a long conversation, and I told him I was in love with him. Good on you. I knew he loved me, but that he wasn't, quote unquote, in love with me. So I asked him not to reach out to me and to let me be the one to initiate contact again in the future, if and when I was ready. He said he'd respect my request and told me I was the best person he's ever known with the kindest heart. And I was in a really dark place in my life, and he'd felt like my son. Cutting him out was the worst pain I'd ever been in. He'd been my best friend and he'd been my first love, but I knew I had to start putting myself first. About 4 months later, I broke no contact to wish him happy birthday. I told him I wasn't ready to reconnect, but just wanted to know I was wishing him well today. He responded, "Thank you," but then said how upset he was with me walking away. He angrily said something along the lines of, "I put you first and respected your wishes instead of advocating for myself. But I care about you. I needed you. I didn't want to lose you, and I'm hurting." I was honestly pretty mad. If he had something to say, he should have said it when I was pouring my heart out. Don't blame me because you weren't being honest. Yeah, I agree, Miranda. I still followed him on social media for another year or two, but we never spoke or interacted again. I saw that he got married. I eventually removed him from social media around 2017. I always had a good memory of him. He treated me really well, and although it ended, it had been largely amicable. I felt he loved me, but never felt in love, and I didn't blame him for that. It just sucked because it was what it was. I'd always been grateful for all the love we'd shared, but he was my first love, and I wasn't sure it would ever be safe to open that door. I was also very afraid that he'd forgotten me, or if I reached out, that he wouldn't respond or would be very short and rude with me. That alone kept me from reaching out, and I'd rather have a happy memory in my head. Okay, before we continue, I just want to take a moment here to say, Miranda's story up until this point, I think has a lot of common things that I think a lot of people go through when they're dating avoidance, right? There's a lot of that self-denial of being like the rationalizing we do to ourselves to explain their behavior. When they're telling you, "I see you as a friend or a sister," it's very easy for us to be like, "Oh, well, maybe they're just not that in love with me. Maybe they like me, but they're just not that into me. If they wanted to, they would," etc., right? And it's very easy to entertain some weird, mind-bending explanations as to why these people don't want to commit and why they don't want to be with us. And I see in Miranda's case, she's listening to everything that Andy is telling her, but she's not actually, I think, allowing herself, understandably, because she's quite young and new to this, to really be like, no. Like, this is bullshit. I can tell that we've actually got something quite significant here. This guy, Andy, is saying, "You're the best person I've ever known. You're so kind." Like, I mean, I ain't saying that to someone who's merely a friend or like a sister to me. Like, when I hear that, it just makes me think Andy doesn't really want to own up to the fact that he actually has these big feelings. And given his trauma, I can understand where that might come from. And I like the way that Miranda described how he tries to be Superman, to abdicate his emotions and make it seem like he's tougher than everyone else. But I think it really goes to show that this is a guy who would struggle in relationships so hard because one way or another, he can't maintain a proper healthy relationship without self-sabotage or entertaining abusive relationships too. So it's a very dangerous position to be in. I will say this. I know not everyone may agree with what I'm about to say, and that's okay. But I have to say, I do feel sorry for people who have a fearful avoidant attachment style, particularly those that are on the severe end, because it must be hell to feel as though you can almost never get it right with relationships. When you're in that wounding, when you're trying to be strong off the back of God knows whatever's happened to you when you were younger, it must be hell feeling like you can't trust anyone, that no one would want to be with you, that if you have a lot of internalized shame about your self-worth, that, you must be destined for people who are just terrible because no one's going to treat you well. And I can imagine the stories and the wounding that gets repeated over and over and over again would just make you feel like you are unlovable, no one will ever want to be with you, you can't trust anyone. I mean, until that's resolved, I could just imagine that, you'd be stuck in your head much of the time. And also, the thing that's important to understand for those that have a fearful avoidant attachment style is they're also exceptionally big feelers. They have big reception to, emotions, even if they try shutting it down. And I think because they often are able to connect with other people and, what they're going through, they can become very easily overwhelmed by another person's emotional well-being, and it disrupts their own equilibrium. But in saying that, I once again always have to remind everyone that it is not an excuse for the impact of their behavior. Just because these individuals have a lot of deep wounding and it must be very hard for them, it's still not a get out of jail free card from being abusive to people as well too. Now, with that all being said, let's get back to Miranda's letter. So this is where things get really interesting. Miranda and Andy reconnect 7 years later, and I could imagine if I were Miranda, I've been in similar positions. If I had an ex who, was telling me, I only see you as a friend, not as a lover, I might similarly conclude that they may not have just been that into me, that this wasn't really a real relationship. But it can feel terrible when you have such big feelings because it can feel like unrequited love. So let's hear what happens in part 2. Miranda continues, "This last summer, I eventually requested to follow Andy on social media. He saw my request immediately, we re-exchanged numbers and texted pretty much all day for the next 2 days, catching up and rehashing our relationship. He said he thought about me often and had Googled me a few times, hoping to find a photo of me and to find out how I was, since I had no social media. He still followed my best friend, hoping to see pictures of me, because she never posts anything other than food though. He said he'd always felt I was the one who got away and that he often wonders what life would have been like had we ended up together. He asked if I regretted not having sex that particular night. I said yes and no. It would have made it harder to let him go, but I loved him and also wished we had. He said the whole night we'd been dinner and hanging out, he'd been thinking of ways to make it work, and what he was wanting to maybe try even long distance, he felt I was worth it and would have switched jobs and come back for me. When I didn't give him my virginity that night, he felt rejected because it had been such a romantic and perfect night and felt I would never fully commit to him. That's why he acted weird the next morning and didn't want to go to breakfast. I needed commitment before I was willing to lose my V-card. Fair enough, Miranda. I think your boundaries around that are perfectly understandable. And he wanted me to lose it as the final act. I was ready before I was ready to fully commit to him. I told him I couldn't do it without him leaving, but he never told me what he was thinking about possibly staying or trying a long-distance relationship. He said he eventually understood my rationale, given that I'd been a virgin, but the feeling of rejection was so strong for so long that he couldn't see past that. But I was never rejecting him, I just didn't want to get more hurt. Had he said he was willing to work it out or try a long-distance relationship, I would have had sex with him. But he chose to not say what he was feeling, and I felt I reiterated to him that I loved him, and he said he doubted how I could love him because he was damaged. And also, how could I have loved him if I wasn't willing to go all the way? He just couldn't see that I loved him, and I think to a degree he still questions it. Additionally, he said that saying I see you as a friend or little sister, and eventually claiming that I wasn't ready for a relationship, was his way of protecting himself. He wanted me to hate him and move on, and felt that was the best way to do it. Which I can say is absolute bullshit. Classic avoidant lying and making a unilateral decision about the fate of the relationship. I told him this was extremely unfair of him and hurt me so badly, more than necessary, yet he still felt it was better than being honest. He doesn't think I would have moved on if I knew the truth, and I said I was mad at him for making that decision for me without my input. He was so afraid of the future he saw with me and felt so rejected when I didn't have sex with him. When I reached out to him a few months later, after we initially broke up and tried to be friends, I found out that he'd been angry with me. He wanted distance from me. I said it was bullshit because he was the one who wanted to be friends. So how could he be angry when I tried? He said he still had feelings for me and still wanted to sleep with me and was angry that he couldn't fully have me. Again, he could have had me had he been honest, but he chose not to be vulnerable. He knew how I felt, and I'd put myself out there twice now. Of course, I never knew until now that he was feeling this. He was just being friendly on the surface. To me back then. Even when we hooked up occasionally, he said he was aware we both had feelings for each other, but he came up with lots of rationalizations why it couldn't work. He wanted to travel and I didn't. Well, actually I did. He felt cultures, this literally had no impact, LOL. Our careers were too different, etc. Basically, he was coming up with a bunch of nonsense as to why this couldn't work. Of course, none of this was relevant or true, but they were the stories he said he fabricated to convince himself he did the right thing and helped him suppress his feelings for me because he just didn't believe it would have worked out. We had too much in common and I was so safe, so it was too good to be true for Andy. It's funny because he clearly admitted they were rationalizations, but then when I pointed out they were all complete bullshit, and I said that I would have loved traveling, I would have had to have coordinated around school breaks, he went back to rationalizing how it wouldn't have worked out and that it would have been for the best. He said that he never reached out after all these years because he was afraid he would fall back in love with me. He never told me he loved me before, so this was a huge revelation. He said he'd been overwhelmingly in love with me and saw a future with me, that I had made him feel so safe and seen in a way no one else ever had. The 2 years we were friends post-breakup, he serially dated, got into terrible relationships with women who treated him like shit. He drank and partied a lot, and ultimately told me these were some of the darkest years of his life. He was spiraling in self-hate and felt intense shame over how he handled things with me. He had some degree of self-awareness that it was stemming from suppressing his feelings for me, but said it took him years to fully understand it. He shared that if he hadn't met his wife when he did, nothing would have stopped him from coming back for me and fighting for us. Even after he got married and had kids, he said it would have hurt way too much to reopen the door and to find out I'd moved on. Interestingly, he also backtracked sometimes, saying he wanted me to move on because he just wanted me to be happy and it would have hurt him to know I was still hung up on him. He said if I'd reached out any sooner, that when I did, he wouldn't have been ready. It took him all this time, nearly 7 years of no contact, for him to start to forgive himself. He does have a tendency of dismissing emotions and pretending that he's Superman, calling emotions weak, having to be strong to overcome them, etc. But then simultaneously saying how much he values vulnerability and how that was always one of the favorite things about me. Yeah, of course it was. But then he also called me too emotional for it. While he shared that he is happily married and at a good place in his life right now, he also shared that he regrets not fighting for me and that he knows what he lost. He said he'll always have some feelings for me, and I find it interesting that he still thinks about me so much and what our life would have been like. I definitely feel like his Phantom X. There's a bit more that Miranda wants to share in just a hot second, but we're going to take a little pause here. Firstly, wow. Like, isn't this interesting? You know, it's one of those things where when you're dating someone who is trying to convince themselves of a narrative that doesn't even exist, they're trying to rationalize why things can't work, it's very easy to believe the BS if we don't stick to our truth and own our emotions and the feelings that are occurring. And so there's a lot that I want to unpack here. I can see someone here said, oh my God, 7 years and a wife. I actually don't think he's probably that happy with his wife and kids. I think it's probably something like, yeah, someone here says he's happily married to someone else. Yeah, I doubt that. This guy couldn't find happiness with, previous partners. He couldn't hold on to you. What makes it seem like he's actually truly happy with this new person? The fact that he reached out to you and, you had a conversation after you initiated reconnecting, to me, makes me think there's a lot of unresolved feelings between the two of you. And it makes me think he's probably not that happy in this relationship. It's probably a distraction. And it's just wild to me that he has just gone to this level of denial to justify all of this and to try and suppress you. A lot of people often think that avoidance, those that are on the severe end, must be so much better off when they move with their new partner. They're getting married. They're doing all the things that we never did. Lest we forget that a lot of this stuff is them trying to take action to remove themselves from the feelings of that relationship with you. Much of this behavior is designed for self-protection, to try and deny that there was ever any real connection between the two of you. They really do try and manage not only the narrative to try and push a lot of those feelings away, but the amount of suppression they go to is wild. And I think it's interesting because we often think of avoidant attachers as being very disconnected from their emotions, which they can be. But even in disconnecting from them, we're still ruled by our emotions, our big emotions in particular. And it just goes to show that this is someone who is being driven so much by his emotional dysregulation that he's someone who feels like you were the one that got away. He was telling you, oh, I wanted you to hate me so you'd get over me. He was making unilateral decisions on behalf of the relationship. He thinks he's doing the right thing by telling you, I just see you as a sister and as a friend. I mean, if he had actually said all of this to you 7 years ago, I could imagine that this would have probably made things a lot easier to understand if he just said, I'm scared. But I think in this day and age, especially for a lot of avoidants, I think a lot of them have been brought up, conditioned, socialized to feel that, you can't be vulnerable. And it's so interesting that he loved that aspect about you, your vulnerability. I know, avoidant partners of mine have said similar things to me, and I'm like, that's wonderful, but if you can't reciprocate, we're kind of fucked. And I think that, what's really quite terrifying about this is just how much you can see that anxious side of him, the avoidance side, and his fearful avoidant disposition. And so it's wild to me, just the amount of rationalizing he went through. So just before we get to Miranda's last part of her letter, I just want to say again, I hope that I know this is one story, and I know that, there's plenty of other cases out there with lots of people who are avoidantly attached. But I just think that when it comes to these experiences, it's so easy for us to doubt ourselves and to think, oh, they never cared and they never loved us. Let this be evidence that the stories that these individuals tell themselves and tell you may not capture the full truth. And at the end of the day, you really, even though it's wonderful to hear them confess and to validate their feelings, I hope that this also gives you a bit of encouragement to just be like, you know what? I felt that they had a lot of feelings for me, and that is enough for me to move forward. Easier said than done when we're faced with our inner critic and a lot of other idiotic voices out there telling you they just weren't that into you. If they wanted to, they would. But I think that it's really important to take this opportunity to remind everyone too that your truth in this matters. So much of the time, these avoidants are avoiding the truth and they can't handle it because it freaks them out. That's kryptonite for a lot of these people. It'd be the same too if you were dating someone who's like mega anxiously attached with someone who's got their head in the sand. But we don't want to have our heads in the sand. We don't want to be going into, an oasis of obfuscation and fog. We're here to try and accept reality. And I think because feelings can be such a mercurial and also at times very non-objective thing for a lot of people, they often feel like, oh, well, if I can't objectively see it, it must not be true. And it's like, no. We need to start validating our truth. And remember, this is how I'm feeling in the moment, and I am allowed to hold on to this because this is my truth. And chances are, if you can own that, you'll probably be able to read a lot of people a lot better. People love to pretend their emotions don't affect them, when in fact they do. So yeah, it's very interesting stuff. All right, Miranda finishes. Reconnecting with Andy has been a wild ride. It's been insane how much it feels like no time has passed. He remembers all of our inside jokes, all my little quirks. He's super responsive, etc. I thought he forgot about me and didn't care that much, yet this proved the absolute opposite. We still talk a lot, though recently had an argument over text, which we'd never fought before, and he immediately started gaslighting me and shut down and walked away from the conversation and didn't talk to me for a few weeks. Then he came back like nothing happened. Ha ha, classic avoidant. I recently went through a dismissive avoidant discard after Andy. So it's been really powerful and validating to hear Andy's account of our relationship because it gives me a lot of understanding about my latest breakup and how, although my latest ex is a dismissive avoidant, I believe it will probably ultimately haunt my recent ex in a similar way. I do think Andy is a little bit more self-aware than most avoidants are. Yes, I've sent him videos about fearful avoidance and made him watch, and he said, they're interesting. I'm also pretty sure his wife is a dismissive avoidant. From what I know about her, that would make sense. I wanted to share this letter with you because it's so rare to actually get closure from an avoidant. I agree. I had no idea about attachment theory until my most recent ex. And while I'm happy Andy and I are able to have a friendship via text, we live far away from each other. I can see how his avoidant tendencies have come out, and it's so clear to me. I'm ultimately glad the relationship didn't work out. Though I do still care about him and always will to a degree, reconnecting has actually helped me let go of him for the final time. Whilst I can see how he's grown, his avoidant tendencies are still there, yeah. It really does take years to change these deep wounds. It has also helped me understand how complex breakups and attachments are and actually really boosted my confidence. I am loved. I am not forgettable. I make an impact on the men that I date. Even if you never talk to them again, they do care, they remember you, and they will ultimately feel it. My God, Miranda, what a phenomenal letter. Thank you so much for sharing that because it was so fucking powerful. And I want to just tap on to that moment where you shared, they will remember and they will ultimately feel it. I adore what you just shared there, because one of the techniques that a lot of avoidants employ, those that are on the severe end, when they're abruptly breaking up with someone, is a term called banishment. And what's really terrifying about this is when they act like they never cared about you, they have forgotten about you, they've moved on without you, you're basically, you didn't even matter, you didn't even exist. And I think when you've been banished by an avoidant attacher, feeling erasure, right? Feeling that sense of like you didn't even matter and you left no impact is one of the most insidious, painful, traumatic feelings a person can ever go through. Without sharing a very, I suppose, traumatizing and very triggering analogy, I heard some other people who I work with say to me, it was one thing to be abused in other ways, but at times I could still tell that when that person was being abusive, whether it be physical or psychological, they still cared because they were fighting me, literally. But to have someone do the complete opposite, where they're abusing me with silence, erasure, and they're walking away like I never even mattered, cut to a wound that I never even knew existed and hurt me so much more because I was made to feel like I didn't even exist. And I think as human beings, we yearn for a degree of significance, not in the sense that we all need to become famous, but I think we yearn to feel connected, like we matter, like, we're lovable, and that, we actually have an impact on those that are around us within reason. I think that's just part of the human condition and the human experience of being social creatures, right? So I think when you've been made to feel like you had this beautiful experience with someone where you really felt like this was your person, for them to suddenly shift and take that away where you're made to feel like you were living in La La Land is really, really damaging. So I think that it's one of those things where I really love the way Miranda really emphasized that point, which is no. Even when these individuals, these avoidant attachers, are acting like you never even mattered, the reality is you did matter. And I'm going to add my own 2 cents. For them to deactivate and to shut down like that, of course you mattered. Like, they wouldn't have that experience. They wouldn't have that fear of intimacy when, you're with someone who doesn't cause them to feel like this is a significant connection, right? And even with this guy, Andy, I saw someone say in the chat, well, a few things we need to think about. What about the children, that he's got now? What also he's having an emotional affair with Miranda, to which I say yes to both of those. One, I feel sorry for his kids because it sounds like, he's not really actually being a responsible dad here and he's subjecting the entire family to degrees of abandonment. And also the other thing too is that even if he thinks that this is totally okay to reconnect with an ex, he's still emotionally entangled with Miranda. And even though I can tell from reading the letter, Miranda's not nearly as entangled in this as she might have once been, and I'm not here to make any judgment about Miranda, that's not my point today. I do hear, like, when I read this letter, I could just tell, like, this has been a very cathartic experience for Miranda, where it does, I think, feels like, the final nail in the coffin psychologically to be like, now this explains everything, and it really helps me to feel like I can distance myself and give myself permission to move on without personalizing this so much. So I think if I had to give my 2 cents with Andy, I worry about him. I don't think he's going to be a particularly great dad. I don't think that he's learned very much off the back of his experiences at all. Maybe he's done a bit of learning, but for him to take 7 years to reflect on all this stuff, I mean, Jesus Christ, that's a long time. It goes to what I've said before, which is these individuals, if they're not working on themselves, it's going to be more of the same. And even you, Miranda, said we just slipped back into each other's lives like nothing ever really changed. We were joking the same way. We were, reminiscing on the past. Our chemistry was still there. I mean, there's obviously something amazing between the two of you. Let's not pretend otherwise. Like, there's obviously something there. If I was married and I still had an old flame out there that I was reconnecting with, if I had unresolved feelings, I would probably still be, going out and finding ways to, engage with that person. But if I don't, there's no way known I'm wanting to re-engage. Those days are done. I can see someone here says it sounds like he's deactivating again. Yeah, I agree. And I agree that it's good that he realizes what he lost. But here's the rub, is that I think he probably doesn't allow himself to really appreciate the full gravity of what he's lost, because we know this guy rationalizes, right? So if he doesn't want to sit with the shame and the guilt and the embarrassment of this, I suspect that for him, he probably justifies it in his head by going back to the same old story. We're of different cultures. We're living in a long distance relationship. We're just too different. And so to me, when I hear this, it just makes me think that whilst he's got a bit more truth now to what he said, I think that to me, when I hear this, it just makes me think this is a man who is running from his own emotional state. He's not being fair to all parties. I saw someone here said it's not fair to his wife. I agree. I don't care what her attachment style is. The fact of the matter is she doesn't deserve to be going through this. And I think that, it's not fair to this new family that he has. Even if he says, I'm happy, to me it just sounds like it's probably a distraction from what's going on. So I worry about the state of Andy's family. But yeah, just to round out this little piece before I dive into some Q&A, I do want to say that this is a really, really, really good letter. And I hope that this has been a good opportunity for those of you that have listened to this to feel a degree maybe of validation, comfort, reassurance that your significance will not be forgotten by these people. No matter how much they try to forget you, to act like you never existed, where they try and ghost you, block you, just push you out into the ether and banish you, you've left an influence on them that they're trying to run away from. And the fact of the matter is that we all have to face our own emotions off the back of it. And even if Miranda is now the subject of a bit of Phantom X, let's be real. The Phantom X can still, elicit some dormant emotions inside of us, right? It doesn't mean that it's just limerence. I hate when coaches and influencers are like, oh, you're not in love, you've got attachment or you've got limerence. It's like, why can't that still be a form of positive regard for someone? Some people online are dumb. But anyways, the point simply is to say is that this guy is obviously definitely, got some unresolved feelings for you, 100 billion%. So Miranda, thank you for sharing this. Later today, I'm going to privately record the next letter for Ken Reads and submit that tonight. But I did want to jump on here and do this because I thought this was just such a fascinating letter, and it's not every day that we hear of stories of closure or, confession like this. And that's why I'm really keen to share them whenever they come up, because you need to hear this as well too. All right, let's do Q&A. Thank you everyone for piling up the questions and answers. I'm just going to move us because I am getting really hot in here and I just need to turn my fan on so I don't boil. All right, let's get into it. I am starting to see someone who I suspect has some fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant behavior. It's hard to tell, but my senses are tingling. What questions can I ask to help my discernment process? Oh, that's a great question. I think that is, if I was in your shoes, I think that some of the questions that I might ask, and I'm pinching some of these from my colleague Tawny, who's been a guest a few times with me, I'd start asking questions like, hey, what have you learned off the back of some of your previous breakups and relationships? What have you learned about love and heartbreak? Like, what does that mean for you? Because it'd be really interesting to hear what they say off the back of it. If they say things like, oh, we just weren't that compatible, or they tell you like, all my exes were crazy, that might start to also validate those spidey senses of yours, where you feel as though this person isn't maybe giving you a full picture as to their past. I also think too that it might be really good to consider, asking them about attachment theory. You could even just gently bring it up, being like, hey, I've been doing a lot of self-development work on myself, and I'm for me, I recognize that I have a tendency to lean secure, anxious, avoidant, whatever you feel is appropriate. And maybe it would be a good opportunity to just see if they have any reaction to attachment theory and introspection. Usually avoidant attachers, I find, I mean, some anxious people can do this too, but I find a lot of avoidance have some very curious answers to that. I'm going to throw this to the chat. If any of you suspected that your new partner that you were dating had avoidant tendencies that were giving you a bit of a warning light, what might be some of the questions you would ask them as well too? Because I think it'd be really interesting to hear what your ideas might be off the back of your experiences. I can see someone here asking the question, have they ever been heartbroken? I think that's a great question to ask. So that's a good one. I can see someone here's given the running emoji with an LOL. I guess there's no questions being asked on this occasion. We're just getting out of there. I think, I'm just trying to think of also another one too, because it's a tricky one to answer as well. Someone here says, ask about their family history. That's a good one to ask. I think if you're going to do that in a gentle way, you might be like, hey, you know, like, how have you learned about love and relationships? You know, what does love and relationships look like for you based on your family history? Someone here's got a question. What was your most amicable breakup like? Love that one. Really? Oh, this is a good one. You want to ask them if they really understand, if they have a solid sense of themselves. Yep. Someone's asked, what were their previous relationships like? I would ask them how they feel. Oh, there goes the chat. Sorry, guys. Oh. I don't know what's going on here. I'd ask them how they would feel about taking the relationship slow. Yep, that's a good one. How do they handle conflict? Do you like to use compartmentalization to cope with difficult times? These are really good. Oh, do you like relationships where you do a lot of things with your partner? How would you describe commitment? What did you learn from your last breakup? How long have they been single versus in partnership? Do you understand the difference between emotions and feelings? I've got another one here. I asked a fearful avoidant about taking it slow. And he passed that test with flying colors, only then to discard and run 5 months later. That's a good point. I think the whole taking it slow thing, it's sort of up there with dating rules where, you know, they might tell you if you're going to get to know someone, give it 3 months before kissing or having sex, right? You hear a few influencers use that as a rule. I've tried that before, and the reason I don't love that rule or approach is because, as this person said, by that time, there's more commitment and investment, and that might be the thing that sets the avoidant attacher off. So I think for me, I would have boundaries around pace, being like, hey, can we take it slow? That's totally fine. But I think that some of these questions you've asked is really good just to see if they understand introspection. I've got another one here. Do you understand the difference between intention and impact? Love that one. You could ask about perfectionism and how they handle stress. Now, that's a great one. We know a lot of fearful avoidants in particular are very perfectionistic, and they also struggle with stress. They often use their dating and relationships as a way to control things because they feel that gives them a sense of, that gives them a sense of control in their otherwise chaotic lives. So that's true. So yeah, I think that a lot of what you've shared here are fantastic. I'm going to do one more. So have you ever felt sorry for someone and why? Love these. I think these are all great. Really, at the end of the day, what you're really looking to get out of these people if you ask these questions is actually to hear the depth of their answers. I've actually got a better test that you can do. I often find that, and you do this naturally, one thing you can do in a really quick way is if you've had like a really bad day at work or you're struggling with something emotionally, what you might do is, without trauma dumping or getting too emotionally, oversharing, let's just say you've had a bad day at work, right? You don't have to give the full details. If they ask you, oh, how have you been? You might say, oh, look, I've been really struggling with work and I'm really having difficulties, navigating my relationship with certain coworkers. And what you could do then is just watch and see how they respond to that. Because often I find the avoidantly inclined people will jump the gun and try and provide a solution for you, being like, oh, are you sure you haven't tried doing this? Have you thought about how your colleague feels? Have you thought about ways to try and improve the situation by doing more of X, Y, Z? And they'll almost avoid listening to the emotional piece of the conversation, because often when you're sharing, I'm having difficulty, you're not necessarily looking for a solution. You're often sharing, I have an emotionally difficult experience that I'm going through. And so I think sometimes I find some avoidant attachers will jump the gun to try and like soothe you through solutions rather than actually sit with the difficult, discomfort of your own emotional stuff that's going on too. Again, I don't do that to necessarily test them. Just do it if it feels natural to you. And you genuinely are like, yeah, I'm struggling with a little bit of stress and I'm just here to talk about it. I'm not looking for solutions. I can see someone here's written, I told them I'd had a bad day and she would come over asking if I could come over and cheer me up. Beautiful, lovely. I think it'd be really interesting to hear how they try and cheer you up though, because if it's just hugs and sex, I don't think that really connects with the emotional stuff. I think them being very good acts of service people, wonderful. But there's more to that than, just the acts of service piece. I think people want to feel seen and heard, and you can just as easily do that over the phone. You don't always need to physically show up for someone. So yeah, bit strange in my opinion with that one. All right, let's continue talking. Let's continue doing questions. My dismissive avoidance situationship had a girlfriend of 5 months and recently passed of cancer. My condolences. He jumped out a window and survived. Jesus. And made the mistake to I made the mistake to DM him when I saw it in his story, and now I caught myself in the same boomerang. I know he has a lot of family issues. His best friend died, and now his girlfriend. What do you think was going through his mind? We messaged a few days, and now I'm back to being ghosted. He wanted to marry me, and he left me for her. Oh Jesus, that's a very sensitive situation. Okay. I'm going to approach this sensitively and try and still offer my own thoughts on this. So I'm going to do my best to respect all parties with this. I want to just say my condolences to him for the loss of his girlfriend who died of cancer, and also to the loss of best friends, because it sounds to me like this is someone who's had tremendous loss in his life. And it still haunts him to this day. Even if he may try and act stoic and like it doesn't bother him, he's obviously got a lot of people in his life who've died for one reason or another, and that's terrible. So I am really sorry for him that he's going through that. And cancer's awful for any and all parties, not just the people who are going through, who have the cancer, but the people who are also supporting their loved ones through it. With that all put to one side, let's take a moment now to just address things a little bit more critically. I have noticed that there is a tendency for dismissive avoidance in particular, and fearfuls, to try and become a bit of a savior for those that are in positions of pain, those who are needy, those who have chronic health issues. Because we know that a lot of avoidant attachers love to feel needed, they love to feel like they're responsible, there is a tendency for them to align themselves with people who have tremendous issues. And so even though I want to be empathetic and say, I'm sure he, there was something here that he obviously wanted to, he was obviously drawn to this person, his ex-wife, I think it is, or his ex-girlfriend who died of cancer. Obviously, there was something there for him that he was drawn to. But it is a common trait for a lot of people with a severe avoidant attachment style to get overly invested in people with big problems, because that makes them feel good inside of themselves. And we know they also have a subconscious fear of abandonment. So if he's got a partner who's just died of cancer, that might make him feel like a failure because he couldn't save her. It also might mean that he feels like there's abandonment and he can't handle it. I can see someone here says addict on addict, for example. Absolutely. Because you can have someone who's codependent with someone who's, a deep addict. So just out of respect to this story, I want to be very sensitive and say, obviously, I'm very sorry for you for what you've been through, because this guy was obviously making, proclamations about wanting to marry you and then got with this new person who subsequently died of cancer. But it sounds to me like this guy has a lot of mental health stuff going on that's running beneath the surface. It sounds like he, had at least some suicidal intentionality behind jumping out of a window. and it sounds like he's not well at all emotionally, and he probably does connect himself to people who are struggling and doesn't have good boundaries around that. But again, this is a delicate subject, and I want to make it very clear that I don't want to make it sound like he's using his ex-girlfriend who died of cancer, or, you know, she was weak and needy and she was just, you know, using him because she was unwell. No, it's not that simple at all. I think there's a lot of complicated processes that go on in these dynamics, and I think that it is interesting how these series of events played out. I'm just trying to address this in a way that's sensitive to all parties, because obviously you've been really hurt. She's died of cancer. He tried, from the sounds of it, killing himself. So this is there's a lot of like intersectional extremes that are going on in this case. It's a great, you know, question you've asked, but it is a very, understandably very triggering example. It's a very delicate example. And I think there's probably a lot of stuff that's gone on with that one. All right, so let's move on to the next question. How do I differentiate between a covert narcissist and avoidant, especially in fearful avoidance? I don't know if you listened to the episode that Amy and I did recently, not the most recent one, but the one before that, where the title I think was something like, "He called me a covert narcissist." In that video, that podcast, we were reading out a letter where the person involved, the fearful avoidant, was chronically blaming their partner for everything. Instead of a fearful avoidant who just, you know, is unsure about the relationship, kind of like what we saw with Andy in this letter reading today, I find that covert narcissists have a lot more stuff going on. There's so much toxic shame that they're often spilling out onto you and to everyone involved. So, for example, I find that, especially off the back of that example that Amy and I read out, the person involved was basically degrading their partner well before the phase where they withdrew. As they were withdrawing, they also blamed their partner for why they were shutting down. And when their partner was trying to help them to have a better life, how to improve their job, they were just getting in the way. The avoidant was getting in their own way of actually having a job, a roof over their head. Essentially, their partner became a bit of a parent, a caregiver, and was still being blamed and attacked. And it was going on chronically throughout the entire experience. And then if I recall correctly, I think he ghosted her. And before he did, he basically blamed her for abandoning him when she'd set boundaries, and then punished her. So if I had to be really overly simplistic, there's a lot of blaming, there's a lot of self-loathing, there's a real big fear of success, which leads these people to chronically fail and be a victim and then complain about how the world has treated me badly and I can never get it right, as if to say, like, it's me who's the victim to all these circumstances. I haven't done anything wrong. So all in all, I'd say you'd be looking at someone who has a lot more personality disturbances than someone who just has a fear of intimacy and or fear of abandonment. That's my answer for that one. And for anyone interested, go check out that video. It was, or that podcast episode, because it was different from a lot of the presentations I've read out before in previous Ken Reads episodes, and also very different from even some of the general cases that I talk about too. There was definitely some personality disturbances in that particular case. Let's see, next one. I blocked my fearful avoidant ex everywhere. He came back regardless, ringing the doorbell 3 times. Last time he was the one to end it, but I kept envisioning him knocking on the door every day as a Pavlovian reflex. Any advice on how to stop? So, in terms of like how to stop envisioning him knocking on the door, that sounds to me like there's probably a bit of stuff going on. Like there could be a bit of PTSD off the back of what you've been through. There could also be a bit of shock about how he just sort of comes back into your life over and over and over again. In which case I'd say, I think I can't really give advice in terms of how to work through it, because you're not my client here and now, but I think you'd probably want to speak to a therapist about that, because it does sound to me like There might be still a little bit of lingering hope that he'll come back. There might be also a bit of, I don't want him to come back and I'm scared of him returning. Maybe this is something where you need to actually discuss having, bigger protection, like maybe an AVO against him. Like, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but basically you need to contact the police and basically get an issue against him for aggravated assault, for, disregarding boundaries. But yeah, I think that if you're still like envisioning him returning, that suggests to me that there is a bit of, shock and trauma that's there. I'd speak to a specialist and I'd actually say, I think I need to bump this up to domestic violence, because even if this guy in particular isn't physically abusive or displaying those traditional signs of domestic violence, he's still abusing your boundaries. You've basically wanted to create space and separation from him. So I think that you have every right to now be like, I'm going to ramp this up for my own protection. And if he can't get that, that's on him. Him coming back to you after you blocked him like that and knocking on your door like that suggests he's very much an addict to you as well, and he can't help himself and he can't respect your boundaries. So I'd say there's big issues there for him and he's really affected you. Okay, let's continue. Do you recommend reconnecting with an ex to talk about what happened and let them know they mattered? Our breakup was toxic. It's been 2 years. I feel like I'd like to own my part in our story, or should I leave it? He was avoidant, I was anxious. This is such a great question. I want to say that I personally reached out to my ex 2 years after everything went down, and I just sent like a couple of voice messages, like about 2-minute voice messages to him, basically stating how the breakup really fucked with me. And that was it. And at that time, I didn't want to get back with him. I didn't really care why he did what he did. I just wanted to own my truth and be like, I respect my role in this. I realized I came in too heavy and strong and I was exceedingly naive and I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And frankly, I should have been more respectful of like where you were at the time with some of your expectations about a relationship. However, the way in which you ended this really did hurt me tremendously and it put me into therapy, and I just hope you never treat someone like that ever again. And they basically came back to me with something kind of pathetic, like, hi Ken, glad to hear you're better, wish you all the best. And that was it. It was just like a simple text. And I remember feeling a combination of things, a bit of disappointment because that was kind of pathetic, but it was such a pathetic response that it made me realize, oh wow, you're not some secure person. You're actually really emotionally unavailable. If I'd ever had an ex reach out with a similar message, I don't think I would give such a cold response. I know for a fact that my time with this person wasn't abusive. It wasn't, crazy dysfunctional. It was a short, sweet episode that ended really traumatically for me. And so answering your question, I'd say, I think if you're going into it from the perspective of, I just want to share my truth and I'm not really, if you're willing to hash it out, wonderful. And they're willing to, great. I think at the end of the day, it's really about, do you feel comfortable to express how their behavior made you feel? Because you have every right to do that. And I have heard cases where the avoidant attacher is open to having a dialogue about it and they may confess what happened back in the day because there's been some time and distance from it. So short answer is I actually say if you're emotionally removed and you don't want this person necessarily back in your life, so to speak, go for it. I actually think it's part of healing. I can see someone here says, so that addiction doesn't equal love, right? I always wondered if my FA truly loved me like he claimed or was attached. Okay, I'm going to go back to saying what I said a little while ago. I know why you've written this, and that's okay. I fucking hate when people reduce love to limerence, addiction, you're attached. Like we all have to be some fucking Buddhist monk who never has intense feelings in our lives. So here's what I'm going to say, just gently. If you felt that this person was addicted to you, what is the basis of said addiction? Feelings, emotions, impulsive, dysregulation as well too, right? So it really depends on what your definition of love is. I personally think that it might be an unhealthy form of love, meaning that this person, wonderful, they can't get enough of me, love that for them. But is it a healthy form of love where that person is regulated and knows how to respect my boundaries? Probably not. Does that feel nicer to hear on yourself compared to, they were just addicted, they never loved me? We know for a fact that, an addict's first love will always be their substance of choice. So if you happen to be said substance, and even if they're not committed to you, they're committed to their escapism, I guess you're still part of that too, right? So I think that when it comes to this line of like, oh, I'm looking for reasons as to whether they were addicted to me or they just didn't love me, stop yourself right there. You, not you specifically, the person who asked this question, but people in general, are resorting to rationalizations now. You're trying to use an avoidant tactic to justify the madness that happened. I know a lot of people, in fact, I think everyone I know who's gone off the back of this, has a little moment of being a bit avoidant off the back of this. Please bear in mind, it is a phase. Many of you have been deeply traumatized by these experiences and you're scrambling for answers. Your inner critic is coming up with a bunch of nonsense. So I just want to say, for the love of God, do not use avoidance strategies like delusion, denial, rationalizations that don't corroborate your feelings to get over this, because it drives me insane, just listening to avoidance justify their BS. But it's equally bad if you try agreeing with the BS as if to say, oh, well, their BS is truth, because it's not. And this is where people who are extremely vulnerable to distortions, to confusion, to gaslighting, people who've usually had a lot of misunderstanding growing up, where they've had very invalidating caregivers, or there's been a lot of lies, secrets, discomfort with the truth, are very vulnerable to reality because they don't know the difference between what is truth versus what is fiction. And it's very easy to just believe what anyone tells you without actually stepping back going, I feel in my heart of hearts, this is what I experienced and this is what I sensed out of you. You got to remember too, think about it like pets. Why do you think dogs in particular are very receptive to the emotional state of other people? We as human beings are very sensitive to other people's emotions too. When we think about the process of transference and countertransference, many of us are really, 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 really good at, picking up emotional states of other people. Some more than others. Like I know for one that I'm particularly attuned to people's emotional well-being and I can pick up shit like that. And some of you, I think a lot of you probably are really good at it too. I work with a lot of people who, are very sensitive and so good at being able to recognize this. So just remember, if it makes it a little easier for you to work through, go back to how you're feeling. I know it's hard because often our head and our hearts are in massive dissonance with one another. Our heart's saying, I feel love, and our head's going, they didn't love you, because of all the conditioning and bullshit we've been intoxicated with from like when we were younger. And it doesn't help when you got friends and family who may be well-intentioned telling you shit like, they never loved you, love wouldn't feel like this, they wouldn't treat you like this if they loved you, blah, blah, blah. Reality is that, how people show love is a reflection of how they grew up. Is it okay all the time? No, because sometimes that love was modeled with abuse. However, why do we often mourn our abusers? Oh, that's right, because often, even though it felt like shit, there was often a basis of highs. There was some good moments in that as well too. It's never usually black and white. There's usually lots of stuff going on. And this leads me to another thing too. I saw a follower reach out to me yesterday with this story that I did. I made this story yesterday where I said it's really invalidating when friends and family tell you to just move on. And a follower added to that saying, I really dislike it when I have, say, a friend who's listening to me talk about my ex and they seem happy at the idea that I've moved on from my avoidant ex, like saying, good, I'm glad you're over them, as if to say like that person was bad for you or that person was bad. And they said rightfully, I felt really annoyed by that because I don't feel like they really understood the complexity of the situation. And I want to say, absolutely. These situations are so complex. And when you've got well-intentioned friends and family acting like, it's a party, you realize this person never loved you, it's so good you've gotten over them, they're really doing you a disservice, because this is one of those things where there often is tremendous positive regard for people who are avoidantly attached. Like I've said many, many times, you didn't fall in love with someone who was just ghosting you, discarding you, breadcrumbing you, stonewalling you, whatever they've done. They often have such incredible parts to them as well too. So just remember, in your recovery process, try and honor all of the experience from the emotional standpoint. And if your inner critic starts to jump in, bitching and complaining about how they never loved you, if they wanted to, they would, etc., really try to challenge that, because a lot of that is just unnecessary noise. So that's where I think it's really important to think about in your healing off the back of this. I see someone here has asked, is it possible dismissive avoidants use words or actions they experienced from their mother? They basically mirror their parents' behavior. Oh yeah, makes sense to me. I mean, I can't think of a specific example that comes off the back of my head, but hell yeah. I mean, I know a lot of, this is a bit of a heteronormative example, straight male dismissive avoidants will often treat their kids the way they were treated by their parents, neglected, emotionally distant, not able to connect properly. So absolutely, they're very good at often taking on those parental traits and then, doing wonderful damage to their kids. So yeah, there is definitely a lot of that. Let's see, what else have we got here? I'm going to do 2 more and then I'm going to run. My dismissive avoidance situationship of 2 years asked to see me soon after a night of the most intimate sex we ever had and then ghosted me all of a sudden. Is this a case of fear of intimacy? Yes, it absolutely is. And if you watch or listen to the podcast, you'll often hear that pattern play out almost identically, right? Like, it's so predictable how it often happens. It's almost like really great intimate moment, withdraw, detach. And that part 2 and 3, phase 2 and 3 can almost happen just like that. So it can be very, very quick, and it can happen, usually very abruptly off the back of an intense intimate moment. It could have been a holiday. It could have been, a trip somewhere. It could have been something else. It's just one of those things where it's very common for a lot of people to, have these intense intimate moments. And it doesn't even have to be, a grand experience. It could literally be a moment where you've shared a great date together. You've only known this person for 3 dates and you've really gotten to know them well. And they're like, oh, you understand me like no one else. And then you never hear from them again, right? That's usually how it plays out, is that there's this building intensity. They can't handle it and then they're out. All right, one more and then I'm out of here because I've got to go. Let's see, what else have we got here? My dismissive avoidant ex ended the relationship. I do believe they love me and I am heartbroken. It's hard to accept. I know this isn't a question, it's more of a statement, but yes, I agree. It's very hard, and I think it's really difficult to reconcile, because who would suddenly break up with someone if they really loved you? It just doesn't make any cognitive sense. All right, I'm going to do an actual question and then I'm going to run. Someone here has written, I think I am a mix of anxious and avoidant. Is that called fearful avoidant? If so, how can I heal? Okay, so I'm going to do my best to give a good answer that's not too reductive. Yes, it's called fearful avoidant attachment, or disorganized attachment, means the same thing. But in terms of healing it, I think one of the best methods I found for a lot of fearful avoidant clients is definitely somatic-based therapy. So I would definitely recommend doing something that's trauma-informed, that really allows you to connect with your body. I would find a therapist that understands attachment and can also help you deal with those core wounds. Hell, reach out to one of my team members. We all do a lot of trauma-based stuff. If you want to talk to, my teammates Catherine or Kate, they both work with a lot of avoidant clients who've got, wounds like that. I know there is this sort of belief for fearful avoidance that I can do this on my own. I don't need anyone to help me. Bad idea. Bad idea. I highly, highly recommend, if you are someone who's avoidantly attached, you absolutely need therapy. Why? Because that process of having a therapeutic relationship will also help you feel more comfortable in intimate relationships. So that's why I think it's really good to do that. I hear someone says Megan is so great. Megan is amazing. The only reason I didn't mention Megan off the top of my head is because she's working as a coach. So she has limitations as to what she can do in the trauma side of things, but she's still amazing with what she does. So I say the same thing for Amy as well too. Amy is actually she identifies with a fearful avoidant attachment style. So even if you just wanted to start somewhere, like doing some awareness work with Amy or Megan, that's a good step. And then if you want to get deeper, you can work with either Kate or Catherine. Point is, just start somewhere with someone. It'll really fast track this process. All right, everybody, thank you very much for being part of this spontaneous live that I did. And I wanted to say, I'm really glad we had the opportunity to go through Miranda's letter. And Miranda, again, thank you very much for submitting this, because it was so good to hear. Very cathartic even for me listening to this as well too, because I'm just like, yep, I knew it. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, no matter where you may be. And I will be back on later, not here, but privately, to do another letter reading. And we will go from there. Thanks, everyone.